So I've been using the new M4 Mac Mini for the past couple of weeks now. I feel like Apple have been updating these machines every year now. Like, I remember the days when you would have to wait years between refreshes, but ever since switching to Apple Silicon, they've been on a roll with it. But yeah, in this video, I wanted to share my experience using the M4 Mac Mini, as well as using the Mac Mini in general for the first time. So first of all, let's get into the unboxing. It's a pretty minimal unboxing. The star of the show, of course, being the newly redesigned M4 Mac Mini. You also get a braided power cable in the box, along with an instructions manual. I've personally gone with the base model M4 Mac Mini with the 10-core CPU and 10-core GPU that comes with 16 gigabytes of unified memory to begin with and 256 gigabytes of SSD storage. The price of this machine starts off at $599 or $499 if you're a student, which is just wild. This might just be one of the best value for money computers that you can buy on the market right now, which is quite funny saying that because Apple usually aren't known for making the most affordable products. So the fact that you can pick this machine up for as low as that definitely makes it a huge steal. I think the key thing here is that the base models now come with 16 gigabytes of unified memory to begin with. Previously, Apple's base model Macs used to start off with 8 gigabytes, which meant that you'd get into this whole debate as to whether or not to get 8 gigabytes or 16. But now all models start off with 16 gigabytes of RAM, and I think that for most users out there, that's going to be more than enough. Of course, the Mac Mini still does start off with only 256 gigabytes of SSD storage. For me personally, I haven't had too many issues with running out of storage on my Mac, mainly because I tend to store any large files like video footage onto an external drive or on the cloud. And if you're the sort of person who typically upgrades their Mac every 3 to 4, maybe 5 years, that should be fine. Although granted, if you are planning on keeping your Mac for the next 5 to 10 years, I think it does make sense to upgrade to 512 gigabytes of storage if you can afford it. You're just going to be a lot more future proofed. And it's worth noting that Mac computers generally last a very long time. I still know people that are using their Intel Mac Minis from back in 2018. So just bear that in mind when choosing your configuration. The design of the Mac Mini has also changed quite a lot this year. Apple have turned it into basically a mini version of the Mac Studio, featuring that taller, chunkier look. The base model Mac Mini features two USB-C ports on the front, along with a headphone jack and LED indicator, as well as a number of ports on the back that we'll get into later. And on the bottom, there's a circle of perforations where the air is sucked in by the cooler. Now, one thing that's caught a lot of people's attention on the internet is the placement of the power button on the bottom of this machine. It was an interesting design decision, but realistically, it's not going to affect how you use your Mac Mini. Sure, it technically does mean that if you want to force reboot your Mac Mini, you'll need to turn the machine over since there isn't enough space to slide your fingers underneath the device. But realistically, you're probably going to be using that button 3, maybe 4 times over the next 5 years. So I very much do consider it to be a non-issue. And for people coming over from Windows to the Mac for the first time, I actually think that the awkward placement of the power button might nudge them into putting their Mac to sleep instead of shutting it down, which generally results in better performance on the Macs. Overall, I very much like the new design of the Mac Mini. It's very clean and minimal, and with it only being 5 by 5 inches wide and long, it barely takes up any room on my desk. It should easily fit underneath most monitors and matches the aesthetic of the studio display I have quite well. It would also be nice to see a space gray version of this device, although I have a feeling that Apple are saving that for a future Mac Mini update. The new Mac Mini weighs just 0.67 kilograms for the M4 version and 0.73 kilograms for the M4 Pro model, which is actually quite heavy considering the size, but it's still light enough to throw into a backpack. So if you're a student traveling home for a couple of days, you can easily carry around your Mac Mini with you. In fact, I recently took my own Mac Mini into the office the other day to get some revision done late in the night, and being able to finally plug the base model Macs to a set of dual monitors via the USB-C port was super useful. Speaking of ports, Apple have changed the arrangement and the availability of the ports on the Mac Minis quite considerably this year. On the front, you have two USB-C ports that each transfer data at 10 gigabits per second, along with a 3.5 millimeter headphone jack. Then on the back, you've got a gigabit Ethernet port, which can be configured up to a 10 gigabit Ethernet port for an additional $100, a full-size HDMI port, along with three additional USB-C ports that support Thunderbolt 4 speeds of 40 gigabits per second on the M4 models and Thunderbolt 5 speeds of 120 gigabits per second on the M4 Pro. I am hoping that the inclusion of Thunderbolt 5 means that Apple can finally update the Studio Display and Pro Display XDRs to support 120 Hz. One of the main limitations of Thunderbolt 4 was that it just didn't have enough bandwidth to transmit that kind of data. You'll also notice that there aren't any USB-A ports on the Mac Mini anymore. Apple have completely done away with them now, which I think is fair enough because at this point, I think that USB-A kind of does just need to die. I know that some people will also be disappointed that the new Mac Mini doesn't feature any SD card slots, even on the higher spec versions, since the Mac Mini is often quite popular amongst creatives. But on the bright side, having those two USB-C ports on the front makes connecting peripherals like an external SSD super easy and convenient. And whilst it would have been nice to have at least one Thunderbolt port on the front, it is still a design choice that I very much appreciate. The only thing to note is that if you apply too much pressure with one hand, the machine will slip back a bit. So you may want to invest in some rubber feet to prevent any unfortunate drops. When it comes to performance, unsurprisingly, the M4 chip performs like a beast. I haven't had any issues with the machine slowing down or even overheating during day-to-day usage, despite the smaller design, even when I'm multitasking with a bunch of apps and windows open in the background. And to be honest, I think that this chipset's capabilities might even be a bit overkill for my current workflow. The most intensive thing that I probably do on my Mac is editing these YouTube videos on Final Cut Pro. And even then, I'm editing ProRes footage that's been shot on my iPhone that's already optimized for this software. Now, I did do a couple of tests between the M4 and M1 chip to see if there was any noticeable difference in performance, and I've got the results in front of me here. So first up, I exported a 17-minute 4K video that was shot entirely on my iPhone in Apple ProRes, and the M4 Mac Mini was able to export that video in 5 minutes and 43 seconds, whilst my M1 MacBook Air took 7 minutes and 13 seconds to export it. I did also notice that the general experience of scrolling through my timeline was a touch nicer on the M4 Mac Mini, with less stuttering and drop frames throughout. Next up, to test the chip's photo editing capabilities, I exported 253 raw images from Lightroom as large JPEG files. The M4 Mac Mini was able to get that done in 8 minutes and 16 seconds, whilst my M1 MacBook Air couldn't actually export the images. I sat there for about 34 minutes, and each time the M1 MacBook Air would just overheat and Lightroom would crash. Whereas on the M4 Mac Mini, I didn't have any overheating issues whatsoever. The fans didn't come on once during the process. Now, realistically, if you're buying a base model M4 Mac Mini, you're probably not going to be exporting 253 raw images and videos all at once. If you're that sort of user, you'll definitely want to go for a M2 Pro Mac Mini or maybe even a Mac Studio. But it's still nice knowing that if you do pick up a base model M4 Mac Mini for sort of office or admin work, you've got a lot of headroom in case you want to get into some creative workflows later down the line. I think the biggest benefit that most people are going to notice with the M4 chip is the ability to connect the Mac Mini to three external displays at once, which is super useful if you work in an office environment and need access to those multiple screens. But otherwise, unless you're a power user, most people probably aren't going to notice a night and day difference between the M4 and M1 chips. That's by no means an indictment on the M4 chip itself. If anything, it just goes to show how good and powerful the M1 chip still is in 2024. And I think that's the reason why most tech reviewers rarely talk about ordinary workflows in their reviews. You'll often notice that whenever you watch a Mac review, we always talk about video and photo editing, which can annoy a lot of casual users. And that's partly because those are the workflows that we engage in the most. So it's what we can speak the most to. But it's also because for most people, the days of us needing more power and performance to run apps like Microsoft Excel and PowerPoint on the Mac are long past us. So it doesn't really make much sense for reviewers to spend ages talking about those sorts of workflows. One thing I was also curious to test out was Apple Intelligence. Apple have, of course, been upgrading the neural engines on their chipsets in recent years, and they're saying that the M4 chips can process up to 38 trillion operations per second. So you would expect that to translate into faster processing speeds for on-device AI tasks like transcription or loading up local large language models. As of right now, Apple Intelligence still is in beta, with quite a few features still pending, but for the ones that are available, I didn't think that there was a huge difference in the time it took to generate responses. But potentially that faster neural engine could come in handy later down the line as Apple and other companies roll out more on-device AI features for the Mac. Another thing that I quickly wanted to touch on was the speakers. First of all, I had no idea that Mac Minis came with built-in speakers. They sound pretty decent on this M4 machine, packing in a surprising amount of bass for such a small package, although as expected, the sound does become quite distorted at higher volumes. So I wouldn't exactly want to rely on these speakers, but it is nice knowing that if your current desk speakers break down, you do have a temporary alternative. So overall, I think the M4 Mac Mini genuinely might be one of the best value for money computers you can buy right now, if not the best. It's insane how Apple have managed to pack in so much power into such a small form factor at such a compelling price point. And yeah, with the base model starting off with 16 gigabytes of RAM at $599, I think it's going to be a steal, especially when it goes on refurbished next year. The only downside I can think of with this machine is that the storage upgrades are still pretty expensive, and it does only start off with 256 gigabytes of memory, which for a lot of people will be fine, but it is something that you'll want to think about before making your buying decision. For me personally, I'm going to be sticking with my M1 MacBook Air, mainly because I need the portability of having a laptop. I'm constantly traveling to different places, between offices, and so being able to get work done on the go is very important to me. And the M1 chip hasn't shown any signs of aging just yet. But if I was working from just one office, I think the M4 Mac Mini would definitely be the way to go. If you've made it this far, you might also want to check out my other video covering some of the best tips and tricks for macOS. Obviously, buying a Mac Mini is one thing, but then knowing how to get the most out of your Mac software is another. So I'll leave a link to that somewhere above here. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure to follow me on Instagram and Twitter and subscribe for the next one.